Welcome to Tipping Spears with Hannah Becker. Today's conversation promises to be an insightful one with a remarkable guest. Whether you're joining us for the first time or you're a regular listener, we're so glad you're here. Our goal is to bring you closer to the innovative leaders and thinkers shaping our future. And today, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Jeffrey Rogg. Dr. Rogg is a senior research fellow at the University of South Florida's Global and National Security Institute. Previously, he was an assistant professor at the Joint Special Operations University and at the Citadel. He was also a postdoctoral fellow at the National Security Affairs Department at the U.S. Naval War College. Jeff is the vice president of the Society for Intelligence History and is on the editorial board of the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. His work has appeared in several academic journals and volumes, as well as media, including the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the National Interest, the Hill, and the Los Angeles Times. Jeff's book, which is one of my favorite reads from this year, The Spy and the State, The History of American Intelligence, was published by Oxford University in 2025. He has a BA in Latin and Ancient History from Swarthmore College, a JD from Villanova University School of Law, an MA in Security Studies from Georgetown, and a PhD in History from the Ohio State University. Well, welcome to Tipping Spears, Dr. Rogg.
Thank you, Hannah. It's great to be with you.
So where does your story begin?
Incidentally, it begins here, and for everyone listening, here is Tampa, Florida, where I actually grew up. And I grew up, we sort of talked about this ourselves, with no ambition or thought of being in, such a complicated world like national security or intelligence. Just fishing, like I was doing yesterday, this weekend. And I actually will return to that because I think it's important, when we talk about, trying to they say all politics is local, trying to think both locally and globally at the same time, and never really forgetting where you came from.
So what first sparked your interest in, kind of military and intelligence? How did that come about?
So that might be part of the origin story. I was 18 and a freshman in college when 9/11 happened, and I think like a lot of people from my generation, it left a big impression that never completely goes away. We hear about it in different generations. Where were you when this happened? I was in my college gym when I could hear over, this is just like radio. You're not listening to Sirius or headphones, something, and obviously that was 9/11 as it was actually happening and being reported. And so that was my first real interest in, and I think for all of us, we were exposed in our lifetimes to intelligence, especially in the subsequent global war on terror, in a way that, previous generations have their own, I guess, tipping points where they start thinking about national security affairs issues. And so for me, that was really where I started getting interested in the military, national security, and intelligence. But intelligence actually started when I was at Georgetown. I went to the security studies program there and didn't know you have to choose a concentration. And it's, the concentrations are like military operations and strategy, national security policy, tech and policy. And then there was intelligence. And I didn't come from an intel background like a lot of people do in the field of intelligence and security studies. I was just interested in it probably for the same reason that a lot of people are. It's just like, what is Intel? What is it doing?
Yeah.
Does it live up to my, is it the conspiratorial side or the mythology that we have about it? I just was interested in it because it's something that, everyone's interested in, but don't know enough about. And so that's what sparked my interest. And then that's what I kept pursuing through my PhD and, now in intelligence studies and intelligence history.
So was there a particular event or person that served as kind of like a catalyst for your career, either there at Georgetown or afterwards?
Actually, it was even before that. It was an undergrad. So, this is where when I teach today and when I talk to college students, I tell them you'd be surprised where you end up. So
Yeah.
I don't know many people in college, and I was not one of them, who's sitting in their seat and thinking, I would love to be a professor someday
Yeah.
or a PhD. And in some respects, a lot of us PhDs actively discourage students from getting PhDs for reasons we don't need to talk about, but there are many. But I had a professor in undergrad, Jim Kurth. I'm still friends with him to this day. And so he just so for his background and then the relationship and how this shaped my career. Jim was a a PhD advisee, and then sort of a mentee, and then a friend of Samuel Huntington's for 40 years. And Huntington, who's probably the finest political scientist of the 20th century, and he was more of a historical political scientist, anyways. But Jim was his student and then friend for many years, and so I took a class with Professor Kurth in undergrad. I still call him Professor Kurth, by the way. It's weird for me to call him Jim. And I didn't think I would eventually follow an academic path at all.
Mhm.
But I stayed in touch with him over the years. And this included a period of time in which, you read some of the bio. I went to law school, didn't
Mhm.
exactly fall in love with law, didn't practice, um, enlisted in the military and didn't exactly do what I wanted to do. And then went to security studies at Georgetown and finally got a PhD. And in your PhD, that's where you need to decide your real research agenda. And so I, again, stayed in touch with Professor Kurth over the years. And the name of the book, my book, The Spy and the State, isn't accidental. Of course, Samuel Huntington's very famous book on civil military relations is The Soldier and the State. And so Professor Kurth and our conversations over the years, and we continue to have them, we're going to have one this week, shaped my interest. And so I decided my academic agenda pivoted towards civil intelligence relations. And so there's no better resource on civil military relations than Jim Kurth, who has a direct connection to really the seminal figure in civil military relations, Samuel Huntington. And so I never expected that when I was 18 years old as an undergrad, that someone would be so, foundational to my own research. And I'm still very grateful that, Jim and I continue to have these great conversations about probably a lot of the same things we talk about and we'll talk about today.
Yeah, no, it's so cool how he kind of planted seeds and inspired you to pursue this path. So I
No,
know.
absolutely. And just so I should mention, behind me, I have Jim's book along with The Soldier and the State and The Common Defense, Samuel Huntington's book, and then my own dissertation. I put my dissertation, the unpublished, really big version that was 1,200 pages, just next to them because, that's kind of where I want it to be, like next to Huntington and Professor Kurth.
So I know, every journey has its hurdles. Can you tell us kind of what some of the biggest obstacles were that you faced in your career and kind of how you overcame those?
Sure. So I sort of alluded to it, and one was, I went into the military trying to do something in particular, and I had kind of, even with law school, I played rugby in college, and there was, so, especially after 9/11, there was something specific that I wanted to do, and then I got injured playing rugby in college, had 3 surgeries that followed me through law school. I worked for the U.S. Army JAG Corps as a 1L,
Mhm.
but I like to tell people it was too much law, not enough Army. And so I'd really, had my mindset on one goal. And when that didn't happen, I didn't really know what I was going to do with my life. And so that's where, I was still interested in security and
Mhm.
security studies. And the military side was never going to go the direction I wanted it
Mhm.
to. So I had to pivot. And this is where, friends really do matter and influences in your life really matter. And, one of my really close friends who became my roommate when we were in the same training in the military together, he also, so he finished that tr course and then started doing that, but as a guardsman. And so he went to Georgetown for his undergrad. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. And Georgetown, I saw it had a security studies degree and for a master's. And so, kind of looking like what am I going to do? Where am I going to live? And so my buddy Chris, and I were kind of talking about it, and he's like, why don't you apply to Georgetown for this master's? So I did kind of on a whim. I was like, okay.
Yeah.
And so first of all, and this is something that I talk to students about to this day, there's something to be said, and we tell people all the time, like go get your dreams and everything,
Mhm.
but you kind of got to have backup plans and
Mhm.
also not be so crushed when your dreams don't happen that you're not able to recover and find something else and not necessarily change fields completely, but go a different direction. So that's what I did. So that was probably the first big challenge I can really think about. And the second one related to that is then when I did go for the next kind of dream, which is, aiming high and writing my dissertation, which evolved into a 1,200 page dissertation, and my committee wasn't too happy about reading all of that. But they warned me, they said, you're probably not going to get published as a first-time author writing something so big and also writing a history of American intelligence
Mhm.
without coming from the IC. Like,
Mhm.
I spent 30 years in the CIA, therefore I should write this, you know, and they asked me during my dissertation defense, what people are going to say, like, why did you write this, or why should you be the person to write this? And one of my responses is, well, no one else was doing it, and I was
Yeah.
willing to take the time and put the real effort, research effort, go to archives, even on my own dime to a certain extent, work nights and weekends, do like a level of research that I didn't even think I would be capable of doing because
Mhm.
it was so deep to dig into,
Mhm.
to read legislative history in the 1790s
Yeah.
and comb through Congress for like little key words like Secret Service, which really means spying. And so the problem that I had is not only was it just the sheer volume of intellectual effort that it took, but then also doing it knowing that there was probably very little chance that it would ever get published
Mhm.
because the odds were stacked against me. Intelligence history, American intelligence
Mhm.
history, first time author, not from the IC. And so I just kind of, I just sort of drove on anyways
Mhm.
and, did the best I could to write a good dissertation, edit it into
Mhm.
what could be a good book, and
Mhm.
work with my wonderful editor, Susan Ferber at Oxford University Press. And so, that's kind of where, I just kind of said, I sort of gave you an account of like, don't overdream
Mhm.
and don't be too disappointed if it doesn't work out. But then I kept dreaming and driving on, and it did work out. So you kind of never know, right? But those were probably the two biggest obstacles to recover from one really profound um, uh, personal challenge, and then to take on another one and risk the same thing. And it worked out this time, and I'm very grateful that it did, and I feel very lucky that it did.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting to hear kind of how the book came to development. I love your book. I'm not like a super history buff, and I'm not from the IC either. So I wasn't sure. Like when it was recommended to me, I was like, oh man, this is long. I don't know, if I'm gonna, and I loved it. I could not, I was very impressed. The level of research, like Revolutionary War archive stuff that you got, Jeff, in this publication was amazing. And it provided such a great foundation. I think it's a must read for anyone in kind of national security, but I also think it touches on a lot of things that all Americans would be very should be very interested in. I think intelligence is something that folks don't think about. We just kind of assume it's working, right? And then when we find out, it was not working appropriately, we raise all hell, like,
Right.
and there's just no in between. So can you tell the audience a little bit more about kind of what your book's about and kind of, why these questions were, so important and pressing to you to dig into?
Sure, Hannah, and you already expressed, I think, one of the reasons why this is not only interesting but important. The topic of intelligence in American intelligence history is, you know, that was one of my initial questions is we need intelligence,
Yeah.
but we constantly find fault with it. It
Oh,
never
yeah.
lives up to our expectations. Either our expectations in the sense of protecting us enough, oh, it failed here, here, and here,
Mhm.
or doing everything the right way, the American way. It just never lives up to what we, and I mean the collective we, the American people, really want of it. And so we have unrealistic expectations. Our interest goes in and out with intelligence. Some periods we're more interested in it, and then it's kind of like flees from public attention, and then something
Yeah.
happens, good, bad, usually on the bad side,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden we're interested in it again. And so I wanted to explain, why we have just this completely bizarre relationship with intelligence in this country, where we're keenly interested in it, but we're not. When we're
Mhm.
interested in it, it's usually for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
And, you mentioned something important, which is, and this was something that I struggled with balancing the audience for the book.
Mhm.
You find that intelligence practitioners themselves who can have and I talk about this with my friends who had very long and important careers in the IC, but even their careers of 30 years is not a lot in the entirety of American intelligence history. And so
Right.
sometimes what you find is a lot of the practitioners don't really know their own history of what they devoted their lives to.
Yeah.
And um, you also see from the practitioner side, so first I'll treat the practitioner side, then the non-Intel professional side, and that includes everyone else. But the practitioners also, a lot of times, are themselves fairly defensive of the intelligence community because they
Mhm.
constantly feel attacked from the outside,
Mhm.
whether it's policymakers, politicians, the press, the public. Um, and they're either resistant to or don't understand, or even if they understand it, I don't know if they have the healthiest reaction
Mhm.
to the negative coverage.
Mhm.
Staying enshrouded in secrecy, if you knew what I knew, you would understand why we do the
Mhm.
things we do. That doesn't work. It just shuts down. You're telling me something. So you're saying I would understand if you could tell me, but you can't tell me. Therefore, I'll
Mhm.
never understand. That doesn't work. And we're seeing why it's failing today. And it's more important today that the public understand intelligence. So I wanted to write for the practitioner audience on the one hand, so they could understand some of their own history, why they have the organizational struggles they do. They understand it on a daily basis of what they saw and experienced, but they don't understand the historical origins of it. Then on the rest of us side, and that includes policymakers,
Mhm.
politicians, members of the public, people from the military or other intelligence or other national security instruments that don't serve in intelligence, I wanted them to understand the intelligence side as well.
Mhm.
So what do we ask the intelligence community to do? What's the internal workings there that we either don't understand or aren't sufficiently appreciative of. The
Mhm.
problems on the Intel side, the very real problems that they have to confront. And so I wanted to balance, and this is what was really difficult, a history of American intelligence that would speak to all those different audiences. And that's whenever I hear someone either from the IC or from the other side, and they tell me that the book enriched them in that way, that's when I feel somewhat vindicated in trying to
Mhm.
write that history, is that people from both sides get something out of it.
Mhm. Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head with it is a bizarre relationship that our country has with intelligence. And I really didn't realize that until I started getting in your book. I thought it was just me. I mean, I grew up way out in the middle of nowhere. My family, like, the G-man, the government is
Right.
like, just they just want to be left alone. No big brother, any of that. And so, but that's kind of how I approached intelligence years ago when I started like professionally getting into some things. And then I was realizing though, reading your book, I was like, no, the American public as a whole, has this very, I mean, it's almost like a bipolar relationship with
That's a
with
good word.
Intel. It's
Yeah.
just, we want it, we don't, like yes, no. It's just like constant back and forth. And it was really interesting to me to kind of see how some things in intelligence have changed over our 250, years of being a nation, and then also how some things had not. And that was really eye-opening.
You know what? I just thought of this, but it's not that this is the position I wouldn't put myself in, but it's like a relationship counselor between
Yeah.
American people on the one
Yeah.
hand and the intelligence community on the other. Because the other thing that I find, and I kind of alluded to this on the side of the practitioner, so when you see public writing about intelligence, both from the ISC side and the everyone else side, it tends to fall into polarities. This is the bipolarity.
Yeah.
The practitioners tend to be overly defensive to the
Yeah.
extent of almost like unapproachable, or they won't
Mhm.
acknowledge. And if they make minor concessions about what the intelligence community does wrong,
Mhm.
they're minor and
Yeah.
de minimis. Um, and that doesn't work because it comes off as too defensive. And or
Mhm.
they go the other direction, and you get people, and I mentioned a few in the book. There was a guy named Victor Marchetti, and he worked for the CIA, and he wrote a book on the cult of intelligence. And they just absolutely hammer their old institution in a way that
Mhm.
also isn't very productive, because it's like,
Mhm.
yes, we do everything wrong, and all your most sinister beliefs about the intelligence community are true. That doesn't help either. But on the other side, what you tend to get among journalists and academics and outsiders, as we'd say, who write about intelligence, is they might be overly critical. And that's what
Mhm.
makes the IC more defensive. And they're overly critical, and everyone just kind of assumes, oh, academics don't like intel. Journalists are always digging for, the
Yeah.
nefarious. And so again, I try to the extent possible And I like one of my sports that I love to follow is boxing. And there was a great
Mhm.
boxing referee, Joe Cortez, who would tell fighters before the fight, I'm firm, but I'm fair. And that's what I
Mhm.
tried to be in writing the book is to, again, a relationship counselor, civil intelligence relations. How do you explain both sides to each side? So that just occurred to me as you were speaking, and I was like, oh yeah, maybe that's kind of what the role of the book is, to sort of arbitrate between the two sides.
I like that. You're like the Gottman marriage family people with
Yeah.
Intel. Yeah. So, what new developments around intelligence are you most excited about?
Well, one, I guess the opportunity that I had is a product of the fact that there's a bigger intelligence studies community. More students are interested in taking classes in intelligence. There's more graduate students studying intelligence. Um, the academic world of intelligence studies programs is expanding. Like the Society for Intelligence History, like there's actually a Society for Intelligence History. You could never
Mhm.
imagine it in earlier years
Mhm.
because no one knew anything about it, right? The fact that the public is more interested in intelligence is providing new opportunities to study it and explain it and have it reach more people in a way that I think is for the common good. And the one other thing on the Intel side is that there is, and even if it will never be what we want it to be,
Mhm.
there is an understanding or a push for more, and the catchword here is transparency.
Mhm.
Just the intelligence community understanding we can't hide behind this shroud of secrecy anymore.
Mhm.
We can't stand behind statements about, we can't talk about this. They need to figure out ways to communicate more effectively with the public, including communicating about things that they can't communicate.
Mhm.
And, so part of it is, and there's this understanding that's almost, people just intuitively understand this from their own jobs and their own personal
Mhm.
lives is like you try and bury your sins.
Mhm.
And that's what the intelligence community has done in previous years. That was, we're on the 50th anniversary still of the Church Committee hearings and the
Mhm.
CIA's family jewels that exposed its sins to the world. And that wasn't good. You don't have to talk about everything you've done wrong. But at the same time, if it is exposed, you better have a darn good way to talk about why you did what you did,
Mhm.
other than saying, and here's the limits of what we'll discuss. So I'm optimistic about, the future of civil intelligence relations in one sense of the intelligence community understands it needs to communicate more
Mhm.
transparently, and the public interest is there. The public
Mhm.
interest is there. So that's I'd say that's exciting for someone like me, an intelligence historian.
Yeah, the public interest is kind of like, that means more accountability and also like more innovation. It's
Right.
was really encouraging. And I was reading through your book and it was just like, wow, the IC has evolved over time. Like it has revised, it has become better. And that was just really, really encouraging. And it's encouraging to hear, kind of how you're seeing this next generation that are actively involved. This isn't something that we're just like, oh, we're just going to let this occur, back
Right.
behind the NSA's little, so no,
Right.
that's really encouraging. So, how has technology shaped the way that we approach intelligence here in the United States?
Oh, that's a really good and long historical question. So this is where culture matters, and the American
Mhm.
people are themselves, I try and avoid like the high dollar words, but technophilic. We love
Yeah.
technology, and this is not just an Intel thing. We've always we prize innovation and invention in the
Yeah.
United States. Look at what we've done with human flight, going from humans literally not flying. Air balloons
Hmm.
are kind of iffy, which were used for intelligence during the Civil War, by the way.
That's true.
I have to, as an intelligence historian, you have to like throw the history in there. But to like going to the moon in 7 generations,
Mhm.
this beggars the imagination. And intelligence is no different, especially in the United States. Um, we invest a lot in the technology and we have high expectations of the outcome. And so one of the ways in which we've seen that is, and my good buddy, his book's on the shelf here, and he's from the IC side, very fair, good critical historian, Nick Reynolds, wrote about World War II in American intelligence and how, the OSS, and Nick came from
Mhm.
the CIA, but the OSS gets a lot of the attention when he says that SIGINT was really, the true the best intelligence was the intelligence produced from signals intelligence during the Second World War. Now, the issue is you can become infatuated with this, at the expense of other key capabilities. But, you do also need to do what you do well. There's an old Latin
Mhm.
saying about that. And so the US does high tech intelligence very well. And in some ways, the benefit also accrues to the public. When we saw what the Cold War produced in terms of
Mhm.
systems and technology that originally had military and intelligence purposes, so computers and the internet, satellites, well, that's made its way, to the commercial and now private sector. And so, technology in some ways it works together, like the private sector side and intelligence work together with innovation and new technology. Now, this is where I'm less excited. You asked what new develops I'm excited about. The problem with this is, and this is one of my concerns, when I look forward based on the past,
Mhm.
not look forward in the optimistic way, look forward in
Yeah.
the, historian being skeptical about the future way. But because of these capabilities we've evolved, we've already seen it. I mean, the ability to surveil people, and we do it to ourselves. Like if
Mhm.
you have an Alexa, if you have the ability to surveil people and pierce their privacy in a way that just would be unimaginable in earlier times in human history, to
Mhm.
be able to get, and I mean collect volumes of data.
Mhm.
Now, using it's a different issue because you have so much of it. But again, just the fact that human privacy is reaching a level of, I mean, how much privacy can you possibly have
Mhm.
unless you live completely off the
Yeah.
grid? And I'm not talking about, oh, if I live in a developed or underdeveloped country, they still have cell phones and technology there.
Yeah.
Smart cities, whether it's the Chinese design or the European design, smart cities are making their way into underdeveloped parts of the world. And the authoritarian uses for this, just
Mhm.
again, I can't imagine why there's always a good argument why we need every little bit of information we can possibly get. If we could have stopped 9/11, if we
Yeah.
knew what toothpaste the hijackers were buying. The problem is like this is what I try and explain to people is privacy is so foundational to American liberty. The founding
Mhm.
fathers understood that. But for intelligence, privacy is just a hurdle you need to
Mhm.
overcome to get information. And that's what you want, information. You don't care about the privacy. I mean, you might say you do, but, I kind of care about it, but I really need this. That argument just keeps racing us to a point where, technology is allowing it, so there's virtually no privacy left. And the authoritarian uses for this
Mhm.
is something that in some ways, I think we just, and this is an American thing,
Mhm.
just say, well, it will never happen here. And that's not good enough to me as a historian because I've seen it happen in enough other places to say no one should say, well, we'll never go there. More particularly when I have enough history of where the intelligence community, and I don't want
Mhm.
to blame any particular organization, but the intelligence community, whether it was before the modern intelligence community, um, in the early 1900s, before there was a CIA, before there was an FBI, with the ways in which the intelligence community has gone overboard and done
Mhm.
things that the American people feel like, well, this is too far. And then the IC doesn't come out and say it. Hey, you know what? We're going to tell you how we went too far. No, it's exposed by a leak or a revelation. These trends are alarming to me as an intelligence historian. How technology can interface with surveillance, with
Mhm.
the erosion of civil liberties and
Mhm.
constitutional rights, and then what that can be used for in terms of authoritarian purposes. Once you start putting these elements together, the picture, one picture that you can get is fairly alarming about the future of the American way of life and our civil liberties.
Mhm. Yeah, your analogy kind of privacy being viewed as a hurdle, kind of within aspects of the I think is really descriptive. And I think that's kind of recognizing how, different objectives, there's different components here, and how that could, domino effect into, rights infringement is something that a lot of people don't think enough about. They just, use Alexa and use their smartphone, and they just don't think twice.
That's that's right. Well, and because the other thing is this is an American thing. We're sort of culturally geared, and then in advertisements and what
Yeah.
that technology has helped us so much, and this is human
Right.
progress.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about that is, I guess, we're going to hammer this point because it's truly that important is, think about how our expectations of information technology in terms of democratization theory,
Hmm.
I try not to get too into the academic weeds sometimes because then it becomes too removed from like public interest. But
Yeah.
there was these theories during the 1990s of how information technology and the spread of information, and now an individual with a cell phone, and then you have the Arab Spring, and this
Mhm.
will lead to democracy because we have more information. When at
Right.
the same time, what we've actually seen is it's cutting the other way.
Yeah.
Authoritarian states are harnessing intelligence capabilities both to defend their own regimes and surveillance at home, and then to extend their power abroad. And
Mhm.
so the opposite is happening from what the most optimistic and the technology
Mhm.
triumphalists are saying, which is, this is the passport to human liberty, information technology. It looks like it's actually going the other direction.
Yeah, that weaponization of, tech, I think, um, is just something folks aren't aware of in mass. I leaned in the camp of, oh wow, we're going to get all this information in the hands of people all over the world. I've traveled, I'm sure you have too, just some places that are in, the far corners of our globe where folks don't have information. They don't know, what they don't know. And when the internet was kind of coming up, that was like my first thought was, oh yeah, that village on the other side of the world I was in decades ago, they'll finally have access to know like what basic human rights are, or all of this. And those places, many of those places, technology has just been totally weaponized in a way that now they're supporting radical extremist groups, and had the opposite effect of what I was so hopeful for.
And what I should add to that is not just in other places where it's
Yeah.
like we know better. American exceptionalism is, I mean, literally less people believe the United States is exceptional, but
Mhm.
the same is happening here. Like the
Yeah.
information technology is actually closing our minds, becoming
Yeah.
radicalizing even in, you know, uh, I don't mind using the word Western society. Westerners who have a history, especially I would say a good history from the Enlightenment,
Mhm.
we're now going away from the Enlightenment and towards like
Mhm.
medieval, just ideological
Mhm.
radicalism and polarized political society that is also a product of disinformation, misinformation,
Yeah.
manipulation by malign adversaries of the United States, but also by ourselves and who we choose
Mhm.
to algorithmically magnify in public dialogue. So,
Mhm.
this isn't just an over there problem, which is how Americans also like to think about intelligence. Oh, that's done over
Yeah.
there. This is very much an over here problem now, too.
Mhm. Yeah, and the effects don't just stay in the interwebs, right?
Right.
So,
No, no,
yeah.
no. We're seeing how people, like the pitchforks and
Mhm.
torches, the online pitchforks and torches are literally becoming like public civil unrest in
Mhm.
countries around, again, you know, places that we are already democracies are looking less democratic. Again, like online pitchforks and torches are now actually becoming not public protests, but public civil unrest in really radical and, radically un-American ways.
Yeah. What's interesting, kind of as you explain it, I was thinking, so my pop was in the Navy a long, long time ago, and he did a very small scale intel work and was a very like progressively thinking kind of about technology. And Pearl Harbor, that information not being acted upon like sooner, just really stuck with him. And I think it really like kind of shaped his paradigm with intelligence. When technology kind of expanded out, when specifically with social media, when that became a thing, I remember he had like this opposite reaction, and I was just observing it, and he was very skeptical of social media, and he was very scared of like being surveilled,
Mhm.
our enemies like collecting all this data on us. Whereas when he was in uniform, it was a lot more laborious, and it's not just like you have this app where all this information is coming from. And that was something that, like, to literally to his dying day, that was this huge concern. If you did, social media is this huge vulnerability in terms of intelligence. Interestingly, especially over the past, 5, 6, 7 years, things with social media, I think have changed to kind of be more of a threat, or at least include the threats that you're describing, where it is can be very internal to the
Mhm.
United States. And I think back about my pops, kind of his fears was, China, Russia, Iran, which they're all doing their stuff. But his fears was they're going to get all this information on us, find vulnerabilities on us, Pearl Harbor, us again, that type of thing. But that's just kind of one element of it. And then the other element is kind of what you're describing as, um, how it's changing our society and our nation, and how people relate to each other, and or if they even like use their brain, or if it's just so much information they're just turning it off and being like medieval dark ages. They got all this information access, but they're just going to be polarized, be divisive. And I think it's a very slippery slope.
I don't know what your dad did as far as what he was involved with Intel, but this is where, there's a fine balance. But a lot of Intel, and we can talk about the conspiratorial
Yeah.
attitude that a lot of Americans have about Intel. But the great British intelligence historian Christopher Andrews says that one of the pathologies of people who are immersed in the conspiratorial world, I mean, like counterintelligence officers,
Mhm.
is they can become conspiratorial themselves. But the problem is, and I say this as I try and be fair to the Intel community. Um, we also have an imbalanced attitude towards the threats.
Mhm.
Sometimes we, and this is an American tendency too, I think, is, we're so self-critical
Mhm.
to an unhealthy point where we're no longer just diagnosing a problem and working we just get consumed with just how bad we are, and we lose
Mhm.
proportion to how bad other actors can be.
Mhm.
And so, even during the Cold War, we did things that no historian, or just if you're exposed to them, no one would argue that we committed, just like, and it happens, we committed human rights abuses, or we abetted people who did in certain places. We did arrange electioneering, and we don't want people tampering in our elections, but we did it.
Mhm.
But you also have to understand the other side. So were much worse people, much, much worse people, the enemies of civilization and everything good that we stand for, were doing the exact same thing for
Mhm.
the exact opposite purposes. One of the things we've lost a sense of is the importance of intentionality. Intentions matter because you can't always go by results. In a world of results, then why don't we just use nukes all the time to solve our problems?
Yeah.
Because intentions do matter. And those who have good intentions are categorically different than those who have bad intentions. But we lost that because now we're told that the only thing to judge is the outcome.
Mhm.
But you can't just judge outcomes. Otherwise, what's the difference between an American soldier and a suicide bomber? Both killed, collateral damage. You killed this many civilians, the suicide bomber killed this many. They did it intentionally. That intention always matters, and we're losing that. And especially when it comes to American intentions,
Mhm.
people can look, there's a US flag in the background. I know I happen to think the best of my country, even though I've studied and pointed out the worst of it in this book. But, our intentions, our intentions, and this is sort of, we're hypocritical at times, but our intentions mattered, and they still matter today. And we're losing that. And this is where, again, I think your father identifying the problems with social media is what adversaries are able to do, and this is technology manipulation. You can sort of algorithmically manipulate what people see, and you
Mhm.
can manipulate it so they see the very worst and they think the very worst. And I
Mhm.
wanted to add another element to that, I'm not a biologist, I'm not a human
Mhm.
physiologist, or I'm not a sociologist, I'm a historian. But in my conversations with people who have more understanding of this aspect, this is where I bring the intel side in. We have to remember that there's a physiological effect that
Mhm.
humans have in response to what they see and what they interact with the world. So one of my concerns with social media is when you're constantly bombarded with your phone with
Mhm.
information. Let's just not even call it news anymore, information. And what you choose to see and continue to click on yourself
Mhm.
can then be selected to be constantly put in your face, you have a physiological reaction. And that reaction can produce dopamine, make you feel good, or it can produce cortisol, stress, and make you feel bad. And one thing we know about drug addicts, and, I mean, to some extent, I'm addicted to my phone. Everyone's addicted to their phone. I have social media that I try and use less and less or use more carefully these days.
Yeah.
But the problem is, just think about it like drug addiction. You get a dopamine effect and a cortisol effect. Those highs and lows create addiction. So I am fundamentally concerned that social media and especially manipulation of information, propaganda, which is an intelligence function, we do it, adversaries do it. I have no, it's not that I don't have qualms with it, but I just understand I take it for fact that it's going to happen is being deliberately used, and people are becoming sort of social media drug addicts, and any kind of addiction is bad psychologically. Look at the mass hysteria we're seeing over just the most outlandish just straight out lies are now passed off as information and distributed around. Um, people who have and there's the death of expertise we can talk about now, how, expertise is no longer valued, and someone who's a non-expert can read a couple Wikipedia pages,
Mhm.
maybe one book, and then apparently go toe to toe in public debate with an actual expert, fail to answer fundamental questions that show they know anything that they're talking about, and then back off and say, well, I'm not an expert, but I'm just asking questions the public should be concerned about. This is bizarre. Talking about bizarre, this is bizarre to me and alarming to me. And how I
Mhm.
see people manipulating themselves
Mhm.
in response to being manipulated is again fundamentally concerning. And I go back to intelligence here because I think there are we have reasonable concerns that a lot of this is deliberate.
Mhm. No, you made a great point, Jeff, kind of the intentionality, and then also I mean, truly physical impacts of what we're seeing kind of in this, cyber domain. I remember, well, now it's been 2 years, but the terrorist attacks on Israel, October 7th, I open up my phone, there's this graphic, things. I have family in Israel. I have friends in Israel. This is like, I mean, a gut reaction. 3 days later, I go to UVA, University of Virginia. I'm on campus. They've started the anti-Israel protests, the students there, either screaming horrible things, all this stuff. And I remember walking by one of them, and she was just very intensely, like anti-Israel, anti-Jewish. And I approached her and I was like, hey, I got family over there. I'm a Jewish woman here in America. Where are you getting this from? Like, were you there? Have you been there? And she was like, no. And she holds out her phone and she shows me this video, Jeff. And I do some research in AI manipulation. It's totally deep fake manipulated stuff. And I explained this to her and she just kept screaming in my face. And it's like, you've got like the facts here, but one thing I tried to recognize in that was, her reaction to this media was as intense as my reaction to the video footage of October 7th. And we're both like tripping, fight or flight on that. And it was just this example that I think I'll never kind of forget about the impact of that type of media. And, back in our day when at 9/11, when the planes hit the buildings, I mean, I thought that was some pretty gruesome footage, but it was nothing like what we see now.
No, and that was so when the American public was exposed to videos of Marine dead at Tarawa
Yeah.
during the Second World War, the American people have to some extent been sheltered from
Mhm.
actually seeing like the real results of violence, and it shocked American audiences at the time. The problem is now it can be used for shock value and manipulated too,
Mhm.
distorted. That's again, this is the bad of technology. The trouble is though, it's not just again, I said not just that people are actively being manipulated, it's that they're manipulating themselves. In other words, they are swallowing
Mhm.
BS. Um, and now it's so outlandish that you can say things that just defy historical fact. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not oh, well, all history can be interpreted. Yeah, I understand we can interpret things differently, but there are historical facts. Like, this thing happened on this date at this time. And, I have to deal with this as a historian all the time. Is like, people don't know basic history, and then it
Yeah.
becomes a debate. And I'm like, "Dude,
Yeah.
but this isn't debatable. This thing happened. Your interpretation of it is this is where you can debate, but this happened. What are you going to do about it?" But now, I mean, we're just losing our minds where someone can say something that is completely historically untrue, and other people just repeat it enough, and then it becomes the truth. Um, one of the things that I guess I'll say from you already identified a good example of it, but there's certain, like, I guess, cultural litmus tests that you can
Mhm.
use. And so I do see today when I look around, I think the U.S. relationship to Israel and just what you pointed out with October 7th is a good cultural litmus test. Like, when it's so self-evident what medieval
Mhm.
barbarism looks like in an attack. I mean, I have no qualms with, as a military historian, understanding the cruelty and inhumanity that we do to each other. But when you have, like, just absolute terrorism, I told you that 9/11 was formative to me. How is it that 20 years after 9/11, so many Americans, millions of Americans, forget what terrorism is and looks like? That was terrorism, unadulterated medieval level, even worse than like terrorism. Like, I mean, it was terrorism taken to a level of just barbarism.
Yeah.
And the fact that people forget about that or somehow get lost in that, this is a cultural failing, an absolute cultural failing. Again, the intentionality. You might not like what war looks like on the aftermath of that. But this is the other thing where, as a military historian, I sit there and I'm like, okay, what do you all expect to happen if terrorists, I'm not going to mince terms, or even, I don't need to debate everyone. I don't need to platform everyone and have a debate over whether Hamas are terrorists or not. They're terrorists. End of discussion. If you don't understand that, then you are either intellectually stunted or morally depraved, or both.
Mhm.
Terrorists are terrorists. Like, and I got no problem with killing terrorists. I don't. I can't have a problem with that because at one time we had the term in international law called hostes humani generis, enemies of all mankind. Those people who do stuff like that are enemies of all mankind. End of discussion. You don't need to rehabilitate all of them. I'm not a psychologist. I work in national security. And when we look at what the US did, for instance, with ISIS, the
Mhm.
world is better off and we are better off with less ISIS around. And I mean that in the most real sense of killing people who are members of ISIS is a good thing. I mean, maybe I'll get canceled for saying that I think getting rid of terrorists is, what do we need to do when you have people who, I mean, this is the type of cultural manipulation that I'm talking about, where we play games in our own minds. Is you're talking about people who would kill you, your family, your kids, your relatives, no qualms at all. We saw it on October 7th. They'll go into your house, they will kill everyone in there with no hesitation. And you want to try and play nice with those people, or you think that you're going to stop and have a conversation as they just executed your relative in front of you.
Mhm.
And this is the mindset that I can't understand it. Um,
Mhm.
and the problem is that more and more people are sympathetic to it.
Mhm.
Where did we lose our souls?
Mhm.
Our understanding of just what fundamentals are. That's the problem when you enter a realm of relativism. That then, and I think about this again from the national security standpoint, here's what alarms me. How do you do national security if you can rationalize things like that to the point where, well, we talked about this kind of before. Rex Kwon Do, if anyone watched Napoleon
Mhm.
Dynamite, like, grab my hand. This is self-defense. Rex Kwon Do, grab my hand. Grab my hand. Not that hand, the other hand. No, with your other hand. Like, we want to try and Rex Kwon Do our way to national security with people who are willing to use any means to kill
Mhm.
us. You can't. Now, we have to have limitations, and those limitations are self-imposed. But this is why I said, October 7th is a litmus test for me in some respects when I look at culture and national security, which I think we should talk about. But um, you have to have some restraints, but that doesn't mean restraints to the point where you can't respond,
Mhm.
and respond in ways that, it's always going to be a give and take, but you
Mhm.
can't do nothing. And sometimes what I see people saying is essentially, we have to give up. If
Mhm.
you hide behind civilians, we can't attack you anymore. I
Mhm.
mean, and the problem that I have with that, and this is where those people clearly don't study national security or war or statecraft, is we developed just war theory so we could still fight the worst of humanity. Terrorists, for instance. We have to be able to do that. And Americans want us to. That's the other thing that I don't understand is like, I think this becomes a little bit of like biomagnification sort of effect where
Mhm.
we think that most people actually think this way as the radicals, who are
Yeah.
wearing terrorist headbands or celebrating
Yeah.
terrorism. I don't think most people are. I think most people either assume it's not as big a problem as it actually is when that number is growing and the number of, I think, centrists are shrinking.
Mhm.
Um, and it's also a problem because who's going to do our national security when everyone is so relativistic in their own head that they're like, well, we can't respond that way and we can't do that because that would be too far. And so what are we supposed to do? Nothing. The average person, I think, wants our countries to defend us from the worst of mankind. If our countries are unable to do that, if we can't do that ourselves, if we can't understand that it's going to involve really complex and
Mhm.
completely unsatisfactory outcomes. No one's going to be completely happy. We can't do national security anymore. So, what do we do in that world? How do we approach national security in the 21st century when, and I don't mind using these kind of like stark moral terms, the bad guys are still willing to do whatever it takes to hurt us. And the good guys are just constantly finding roadblocks to respond,
Mhm.
but you need to respond.
Mhm.
These are my big concerns too when I look at and this is wider than intelligence, when I look at
Mhm.
the environment, the global national security environment that the US and some of our allies are facing.
Yeah. No, that's a great description, Jeff. I appreciate you kind of outlining the interplay there. I think folks often think about intelligence kind of like how we think about technology or like weapon systems, I guess if you want to use, it's like we think about it as kind of like a tool. And all these tools are in the toolbox we use for, national defense and the component of morality and intentionality. Is just something that we don't really kind of add that to the scope there as far as like a priority or a discussion or even something worthy of being discussed and scrutinized because being a pacifist isn't going to support our national defense goals.
Well, so that's this is important. I'm glad you said that. Is so, I had this discussion. This is where, again, Tampa, Florida, we might want to come
Mhm.
back to this. Is most of my friends aren't interested in national security. I
Mhm.
am. It's
Yeah.
what I do. But I was just fishing yesterday with a buddy, and he asked some questions from time to time, but otherwise doesn't really affect him on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
They kind of just take it for granted that it happens. And this
Right.
is where there's this, unrealistic expectations. If there's a failure, it's like, you all failed me, my
Yeah.
security. But then I was disinterested in it until the moment where it affected me personally. And
Mhm.
so, that general, and there's something sort of charmingly American about that, the
Yeah.
ability to be disinterested in the world. But it's kind of like Leon Trotsky said, I'm going to quote a communist here, you might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Same thing with intelligence and same thing for the public. And,
Mhm.
um, again, I'm glad you mentioned, then we can't do anything. So let's listen to the people who are keeping on finding these stumbling blocks. Like,
Mhm.
America does everything bad. You can't do this. You
Mhm.
have to do that. Do we want to listen to them? And do we want them to do national security policy for us? I listen, when I listen to the podcast world,
Mhm.
and I see some of the pundits, not experts, pundits who are brought on, and I'm like, but I don't want this person to be responsible for protecting me and my family because they're telling me that we can't do anything. And I'm
Yeah.
like, so you're going to let terrorists just come here and kill us? I'm not trying to hyper fixate on the terrorist threat. You're going to let the Chinese perhaps manipulate the US or the Russians or Qatar or a foreign country try and manipulate American public opinion. You're not going to respond at all. Or you're not going to try and tell the American public, like, this is where
Mhm.
adversaries are doing these things. And this is where the information space, I'll acknowledge it. It's extraordinarily complicated. I don't want to censor, but at the same time, you people need to be aware of
Mhm.
what foreign actors are doing to manipulate our public opinion. But then, because we live in the world of political polarity and
Mhm.
manipulation, they're like, well, I don't believe you, or we do the same thing, or what do you want to do about it? And I think and you sort of isolated this. What are we going to do about it? That's the challenge. And that's where I said we're always going to be unsatisfied with the outcome. What
Mhm.
I tell students when it comes to national security is you don't get to choose between good and bad. You choose between bad and worse. And your job is to be able to distinguish the difference between the two and choose bad over worse. Because from a moral standpoint, that is morally better to identify this is bad, but this is worse. I'm going to go with the bad option, even though people are not going to like me for it. That's important. Otherwise, you can't do national security. And I probably don't want you to do national security, to be perfectly honest. And this goes to, we sort of have talked around this issue and, you can kind of tell I'm hitting hot button issues because we have to be able to, like
Mhm.
people who dedicated their lives to studying this and serving it have to be able to. One of the problems that I see is so the Austrian businessman Peter Drucker supposedly said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Now he was talking about business strategy, but I think the same applies to national security and strategy and statecraft. So we have 20 years of our best strategy and strategists, culture in Iraq and Afghanistan, eating our strategies for breakfast
Mhm.
every day for 20 years. Because part of the problem was is we tried to ignore or didn't talk about culture. And I think again, this is where I kind of believe in the collective wisdom. I think the average person by the end is like, wait, what is our goal there? And it's like, well,
Mhm.
to create a democracy in Iraq, which doesn't really have a strong democratic tradition and perhaps has cultural elements that even if it had democracy, and we have Egypt as an example with the election of Mohammed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood after the fall of Hosni Mubarak, their democracy would probably look nothing like ours and perhaps be worse for American national interests if it was democratic. I mean, this isn't Jeffersonian American democracy.
Yeah.
And so this is where identifying culture and cultural elements is absolutely essential for making strategy and doing statecraft. And Americans, again, in a sense of American exceptionalism,
Mhm.
will sometimes become culturally, superior in the sense of everyone wants the same culture as us, mirror
Mhm.
imaging in intelligence terms, and then working off of that fundamentally flawed assumption and refusing to identify the other cultures and even understanding our own culture. You can't make good strategy in statecraft if you live in the world of monoculture or cultural
Mhm.
relativism. And so, that's something that I think I also talk about in the book is American culture. It's important to understand how culture shapes national security establishments, and that doesn't just apply here, it applies overseas as well, and it applies in our interaction in the world. And so, I'll add that element is we need to start fundamentally confronting cultural differences in the world, and that includes identifying and including in ourselves, I'll stipulate, bad elements of culture, bad elements, and saying this is a bad element of that culture, even our own sometimes. But if we can't do that and all cultures are equally, we're in trouble, and we already are.
Mhm. And that's great advice. Good insight, Jeff. So I know you've mentioned a few things kind of throughout, but kind of that disconnect between American public and what needs to happen in intelligence. What do you think, like, 2025 today, what do you think is one of the more like misunderstood elements of intelligence by the American public? Like, what does, Joe Blow on your fishing trip, like, what do they get wrong? What do they assume incorrectly about the intelligence community?
I'll give you one better. Bob. My buddy's name is Bob, and there's a
Okay.
there's a great song called "Redneck Yacht Club" by Craig
Yes,
Morgan, a country song, and they say Bob's our president, so Bob's the president of the Redneck Yacht Club down here.
I love
Yeah.
that.
So most understood. Well, we've done such a good job so far of avoiding controversial topics. Let's just keep going with it. The political polarization, especially born of what I think is just a contemporary incarnation of just old American stereotype, which is the deep state idea.
Mhm.
And I want to be careful about that in the sense of, so this is where I use history. I'm leaning on history when I say Americans have always sort of thought of intelligence as a deep state or as something else that's conspiratorial. We don't know what they're doing. They're doing stuff though. That stuff might involve us. And every time we find just enough to piece together that that's true, then we're like, see, there it is. What did I tell you? And again, what I would encourage, my fellow Americans and listeners to understand is like this is not a historical aberration right now. The term we're using is deep state, but Americans, and this is a cultural aspect, is we've always fundamentally had problems with intelligence. It cuts against the very spirit of everything this country is about. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, and we need to for national security reasons, but transparency, fair dealing, forthright, the relationship of one American to another. Intelligence officers will live undercover. They won't tell their friends they work for the
Mhm.
CIA. In many cases, and for those who are undercover. And so, we're able, there's elements of intelligence that are lend themselves to conspiratorial ideas about intelligence. And the one that we're seeing today, and it's used, and what I'm worried about, and I think I'm just echoing millions of Americans, is how, utterly politically polarized we are to the point where we're drawing really hard lines over things that are extraordinarily complicated.
Mhm.
And we're losing a sense of proportion. And so, the deep state problem that I have is not that there can't be elements of intelligence that don't really work in favor of
Mhm.
democracy in the sense of, there's naturally anti-democratic elements to what
Mhm.
intelligence is. We Americans have to understand that. Then you also have the problem where the intelligence community itself, or people that speak for it, enter domestic political debates, or they enter domestic political controversies. And again, my warning as an intelligence historian is don't do that. Stay away from it. I understand that you think it's very important, and we're all protecting the Constitution. I hear that constantly is like, but I protect the.
Mhm.
I took an oath. You may have taken an oath. Every American, Americans generally, even if they didn't take the actual oath, feel like I'm defending the Constitution. It's so dear to us, and the principles of it are so dear to us that we all think we are the guardians of the Constitution.
Mhm.
But I've seen that been taken to extremes in the intelligence community in a way that I don't think those officers themselves are keenly aware enough of American intelligence history. This is where they
Mhm.
need to know their own history. And anytime the intelligence community starts touching domestic political
Mhm.
controversies, and I'm not talking about political controversies in the national security sense, I mean hard partisan politics. Democrats, Republicans. I can go back further, by the way.
Mhm.
Federalists and the
Yeah.
Democratic Republicans at the start of the United States itself, it just ends badly. It doesn't work out for the intelligence community. It doesn't work out for the American people. It doesn't work out for the country.
Mhm.
So we're seeing that again today. And what it is, the misunderstanding that is foundational to it is again the public's thinking about intelligence. And I'll sort of say this too. And I know it's so I kind of just criticize the intelligence community. Here's where I'll defend it. I do have friends in the intelligence community
Mhm.
in different organizations and agencies, and I'm not trying to tell your viewers rest assured because Jeff Rogg says so, but I don't know a single one who wakes up saying, "How can I affect or hurt my fellow Americans' rights and constitutional and civil liberties
Mhm.
today?" I don't know a single one who does, and more particularly, the intelligence community, there's a lot of different viewpoints in there.
Mhm.
So there to say that there's it's all a deep state, what do you mean, deep state? Who? Name them, what organization, the entire organization, everyone? Are you really sure about that? So this is again a giant misunderstanding.
Mhm.
There's elements of truth in all the narratives that people choose to believe. That's why you believe it, because there's elements of truth. Although today, like we said, you don't even need elements of truth to believe outlandish things anymore. Um, but that's something that I try and tackle is this is what the American people should understand about intelligence, and this is what intelligence officers need to understand about the American people. So maybe you can not avoid, but confront the lightning rods in a healthy way,
Mhm.
like domestic partisan politics.
Mhm. Yeah, well, that was one thing that was really reassuring to me when I read your book. When I got the book, I was like, oh gosh, this is going to freak me out. I'm never going to use the internet again. This is going to scare me. But I read your book and it was so reassuring that it was kind of truly like there's nothing new under the sun in terms of American intelligence. It was just like full circle. And I was reading about the Federalists and, back in the day, and I was like, wait, what? Is this recent? And it was so interesting.
Yeah, that's the thing is sometimes I like to sort of set people up by what if I told you this happened and then
Yeah.
this happened and people are thinking I'm talking about today, but I'm really talking
Yeah.
about something that happened before. It's like, so, you see, we're human beings and we have inherent frailties and human nature doesn't change all that much. So some of the mistakes that we make, we're going to continue to make because we're
Yeah.
humans. And you know what? Actually, that's an important point too, as well, which is, you know, we're so geared towards like we're going to fix this mistake.
Mhm.
We're going to solve this problem that no one else could ever solve in human history. No humans ever could solve the problem. We'll never have another war again. There's certain, this is where being a historian is somewhat helpful, maybe. There's certain problems and mistakes that I just assume we're going to keep making. And that maybe we can improve the degree to which we don't go overboard. You know, um, and by the way, in the age of like nuclear weapons,
Mhm.
there's probably certain mistakes and things we need to be very careful about making so we don't end up like nuking the world and humanity. And that includes depriving other malign adversaries of having nuclear weapons. It's probably a good thing too, just in case. I know I'm kind of reviewing or revealing my policy positions a little bit, not my politics, my policy positions here. But again, you have to have lines that you stand on. Like you have to have that. But my point of that is we're so geared towards like I'm not trying to necessarily, because I've had people ask me like, well, what would you do to fix intelligence and fix this and fix that? And it's like, well, sometimes you're asking me questions to fix things that I just don't think we're ever going to fix. Maybe we'll mitigate some of the problems. Maybe we will manage them enough that it becomes an acceptable level of mistake making.
Mhm.
But, you know, again, American exceptionalism, American culture is so geared towards we will solve this problem. And so we
Mhm.
even see that in our foreign policy is like, what we're going to end wars in regions that have always had wars, including our own. We're going to, not to spin off too far, but like peace in the Middle East, like I'm a military historian. There's never been peace anywhere in human history and in that part of the world in particular. Why? Like what is the like obsession with that as well? Like we Americans will come in and solve this problem, and then next thing we're also going to take ideologies that are fundamentally anti-American, like socialism, and say, and now we're going to fix it here,
Mhm.
using something that's never worked anywhere. Again, I'm sort of revealing policy positions I have, but it's important. I've realized this myself. I'm careful when I interact with students because I want to see what they believe without the bias of, oh, if the professor thinks this, they're going to grade me this way or that way.
Yeah.
I don't do it, and Jim Kurth, my mentor, never did that. I think I know him pretty well by this point. I know what he thinks about core things, but
Oh.
as a student, I didn't really know, and I think that was for the best. But he did challenge us,
Mhm.
and he challenged us equally. The problem though today is I do think I see a lot of people. Sorry, I know this sounds like I spin off on things, but this is what academics do when we frustrate people to no end with this. But there's a great poem by William Butler Yeats, The Second Coming, that he wrote in 1919 after the end of the First World War. And when he thought his wife was dying of Spanish influenza, I believe she didn't. But in The Second Coming, he says, and this is important, the center cannot hold. But then a couple lines down, he says, the best last lack all conviction, and the worst are full of passionate intensity. And so what I worry about is, I see a lot of people who I think are well intentioned, sort of unsure now because they look around and they're unsure about our place in the world. And
Mhm.
if I just spent my entire book saying all the stuff that the U.S. did wrong, then
Mhm.
you'll probably walk away not having a good opinion of the intelligence community or the
Yeah.
United States. And instead, so the best people are kind of like keeping their mouths shut. And like, I think
Mhm.
most people can see things for what they are. And then some of the worst elements are the ones who are browbeating the rest of us over some truly bad ideas
Mhm.
and like really anti-American cultural
Mhm.
ideas, about what a terrorist is or isn't, or,
Mhm.
what a system of economics which just won't work anywhere and you have to be authoritarian to implement it, we should have. Again, I'm revealing positions because if I don't talk about it, then, damn it, who will?
Yeah.
Like, it's bad history. Like, if you
Mhm.
believe that stuff, it's bad history. Like, you didn't read your history, or at least if you did, you really didn't learn the right history or the right lessons from that history. If I wrote a history of bad ideas, I could probably speak to some of the people that I see touting them and say this person is the collection of bad historical ideas.
Mhm.
And by the way, if you want to try it, go ahead. Historian here to tell you it's just not going to work, and don't expect anything better than what you got in previous years of war, horror, depression, et cetera, et cetera. So I know that sounds like it's a diversion, but I guess when you study something like the history of American intelligence, it's just so total in having to study culture, society,
Mhm.
government, people, war, peace, that you start to like see more and more of what's going on today.
Jeff, what are your top concerns about, national security and intelligence? Like, what is the stuff that kind of, keeps you up at night that you're really worried about? And I know you've mentioned, a few things, but are there any kind of additional, or you can, expound on kind of what you've already raised, but what really bothers you?
I guess we've talked about quite a bit, but to
Mhm.
sort of relist them so they can just have focus as
Yeah.
questions for for people listening. So the relationship between intelligence and technology, like I
Mhm.
said, you know, when we bend towards the ability to like almost have of both non-state actors, state actors, private corporations, governments, friendly governments like our own, for
Mhm.
instance, versus adversarial governments, do we really want, is it good that technology is going to diminish privacy to the point of non-existence? And then with that privacy, and we've spoken about this, the ability to penetrate every human mind with
Mhm.
information that couldn't be distorted, manipulated, like you said in the case of images, outright lies fed to
Mhm.
people who now have had their fundamental beliefs so questioned and diminished that they'll just accept anything.
Mhm.
When you link all of that together, it's a pretty alarming picture of the world. Um, we talked about this too, our own culture and our own cultural understanding,
Mhm.
including having a sense of, I guess, we need as a country to come to terms with what we do right, what we do
Mhm.
wrong, what we can do better, and understand that, be that as it may, we're still the good guys. We're still the good guys. I have listed in the book tons of ways in which we have not acted in the best, with the best of intentions or in the best
Mhm.
ways. I can still say affirmatively on the basis of that history and the history that I've studied, 2,500 years of military history, you can't do much better than the United States when it comes to being truly a historical force for good. And that's going to come with consequences and
Mhm.
sometimes adverse outcomes. But losing that sense of proportion that we have today is one of my enormous concerns. Seeing young people who doubt that, even seeing older generations who
Mhm.
still doubt that the US is a force for good. And if we're not, then who is? And
Mhm.
if our allies that share our belief systems try and emulate them to a certain extent, the best of us, you know, this is the center cannot hold. And
Mhm.
then what I guess I get at, and this is something where I want a broader understanding of this is, you know, more people need to get involved. Not they won't necessarily be able to go pull the levers of power,
Mhm.
but get involved in understanding things like intelligence and national security and having a better appreciation for, and use this word, and I thank you for it, the complexity of it. Yes, I get it. If you were king or queen for a day, in your
Mhm.
infinite wisdom, you would solve all the world's problems because you have all the best ideas. You need a sense of humility and a better sense of understanding of just how complicated it is to make national security policy and then execute it, understanding that you're not going to please everyone, but you have to do it for the collective good. There's a book that I read years ago called The Magus, and there's a line in it that's always resonated with me. And it's the two interlocutors are talking, and one says to the other, the human race is unimportant. It's your own self that you shouldn't betray. So this kind of echoes old historical wisdom of to thy own self be true. Um, it's not that the human race is unimportant, but they're just saying, like, before you focus on fixing the world's problems, understand yourself. And so the other says to them, well, I suppose you could say that Hitler didn't betray his self. And the other says back, that's true. Hitler didn't, but millions of Germans did. And that was the tragedy. Not that one man had the courage to be evil, but that millions had not the courage to be good. And that's one of my biggest concerns today is I keep hearing about, and I sort of have my faith and hope in the
Mhm.
collective good of enough people
Mhm.
that the radicals and the fringes that have truly bad ideas are divisive and will not benefit the security and health of our republic are occupying a bigger space in social media, a bigger space in politics and debate and society, and hopefully, though, God forbid, not a bigger space in actual decision making and policy.
Mhm.
I want to see more of the millions of Americans and dare them to be good, even in spite of some people who are evil. And so that's one of my biggest concerns is that the center holds. And we need to make sure it's our responsibility in the millions, not just a couple experts, not just a couple government people, not just a couple intelligence officers. We need to make sure the center holds in this country.
So what career advice do you have for, the next generation of professionals interested in working in intelligence?
Oh, career advice.
Mm,
I give them this is so part of it is, we all enter the world thinking we're going to change it without realizing
mhm.
the world is going to change us.
Oh, okay.
So, understand that the IC will change you. And I've actually said, and this isn't just to undergraduates, when I worked at JSOW and
Mhm,
talked to actual currently serving military and intelligence professionals, and at the Naval War College, the same thing. I told them, like, think about where you are in your career and think about what you thought before you entered. What
mhm.
and then constantly tell yourself, and maybe keep a diary. And I think this is just a good exercise anyways.
Yeah.
But what when you walked in and you were like, like me, like an E4 in the military, like what did you see and you're like, man, if I was a general, I would change this? Or what
Mhm,
did you think you would change if you could change it? If you really were king or queen for a day. And then as your career evolves, do you still think there's things, are you going to fight the system still? Are there still things you would change, or did you become part of the system? And if so, why? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? In other words, did you let the system change you in a good way or a bad way? Or even to that point, again, have that sense of humility. What did you change for the better? Did you stand up for your beliefs at an important time? Not to the destruction of the entire system. We can't have
mhm.
everyone stand up to their beliefs to the point where the system shuts down,
Yeah.
but enough so that you move things in a good direction. So, go entering into national security, you have to have some humility about the complexity of the system and that you're one small piece of a very complicated system
Mhm,
that involves not just people, but also organizations, bureaucracies, standard operating procedures, laws,
mhm,
politicians and politics, and also just ideas. Like American ideas about what the world is and what national security could be, and your own ideas about what the world is and what national security could or should be. So I think that's that would be the advice that I would give, again, not just to people entering national security, but people already in it.
I love the idea of the exercise of the diary. I'm gonna have to implement that. That's a great one.
Yeah, see, well, and then hey, the good news, sometimes some of the best things that we read are people's recollections and diaries. And by the way, as a historian, what I'll say is they're important for the historical record.
Oh.
Especially because what to me fascinates me is one of the things that I also will say is I never presume who my students are. And I don't mean that in the professional military setting, but also maybe a student in my classroom, an undergraduate, will be a senior decision maker someday.
Mhm,
I want them to be as intellectually prepared and educated
mhm,
to encounter hard choices and choose bad over worse,
mhm,
to understand that they're probably going to be pilloried for their decision making. And as long as they're pilloried by the bad people who they shouldn't listen to, you can look at yourself in the mirror and say, I made the best choice with the decisions, made the best decision with the information I had at that time. I made the right choice. Because that's the other thing that I tell them is, I think we all know in national security, there's people who can look at themselves in the mirror and people who might not like what they see. There's people who sleep well at night and people who don't.
mhm,
And I tell students like, and that includes professionals, like I want them to be the people that can still look at themselves in the mirror and be proud, and the people who sleep well at night, with based on the base of the decisions they made. Not because bad things didn't happen, but because there's a certain peace and acceptance that like I did the right thing and made the best decision I could with the information I had at that time, and I do it over again, um, under the circumstances, hard, difficult, completely unsolvable problem circumstances.
mhm.
Yeah.
So looking forward, what developments are you most hopeful about in terms of the future of national security? So I know we nitpicked and criticized a lot, but Anything that
Can
brings you kind of hope.
Am I allowed to be hopeful as a historian, especially, a military historian who is just reading one like failure after another that leads to millions of deaths,
That's
um,
true.
and seeing the worst of humanity? Okay, so you already read my bio. I studied Latin in college. Yes, Latin nerd in high school too. And I liked reading Tacitus. Tacitus, a Roman historian, wrote about the early Roman Empire, and then as it kept, I guess we'll say, devolving,
Uh-huh.
worse and worse emperors, really nasty stuff, bad wars, palace intrigue that, mass killings and
Yeah.
prescriptions, killing good people and having good people
Mhm.
kill themselves.
Mhm.
Seneca, the Roman philosopher, famously had to kill himself. Um, Ordered by the emperor. And Tacitus has a line, Posse etiam sub male principis magnus virus esse. Good men can still serve under bad leaders. And, maybe this is a part of the career advice, but it's what I'm hopeful about is like, you know, even if you don't like all the trends you see, you can still be a force for good. That's what I mean about the US being a force for good. And so I guess, hopeful trends. Well, I kind of outlined a fairly bad
Mhm.
picture, but, you know, this is where it becomes the personal element and knowing the people that I do in national security, some of the most impressive human beings. And I mean that in the total sense of impressive. Not just, that they can shoot a gun really well, um, impressively well, but really impressive people have and still do serve in these positions. And I want to keep seeing those people in government because that's what gives me hope for national security is when I see truly amazing, incredible human beings doing extraordinarily hard things, sometimes like superhero level stuff.
Mhm.
Like they say truth is stranger than fiction. Sometimes you read this and you're like, I can't believe a human being did that.
Mhm.
Um, that's what makes me hopeful is, the people that we can place in good national security positions. The picture itself that I painted is dire because I'm not going to mince words. It is
Mhm.
dire, like the position of the US in the world, the position that we even think of ourselves in the world, what we see happening here politically, overseas politically, war, pestilence like COVID comes back
Mhm.
around, nuclear weapons, worse weapons that we might develop, social media manipulation.
Mhm.
This is all dire. But then again, when I look at the arc of human history, every generation could probably say that too. They encountered no less and sometimes greater challenges than we did. And what overcame them, or why countries like the US evolved, is because, you know, um, exceptional people did some really exceptional
Yeah.
things, and good people were a force behind it in enough numbers. So that's what I'm hopeful for. And I know that might sound like I'm punting the football, like, I'm supposed to tell you that there's some secret technology or secret plan in the works that's going to save humanity. But I just said, like, I don't believe in solutions to intractable problems.
Mhm.
I believe in our ability as good people to encounter problems and be resilient enough, as a country, as a culture, as a republic, to not overcome, but at least mitigate these problems and preserve the American way of life.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Dr. Rogg, for coming on the podcast. Your insights into the world of intelligence and national security are incredibly enlightening, and I'm sure have encouraged and kind of opened the eyes to a lot of folks. Do you have any final words of advice or parting thoughts as we close out today?
Oh, it's maybe the self-serving wish of every historian that people, I want to say read more history, listen to more
Mhm.
history, just, and approach it with humility. Because that's the thing is like you can have theories and ideas about the world, how it should work, how it will work in the future
Mhm.
versus the past. But the past we can actually put our hands on and say, this happened.
Mhm.
Smarter people, better people in tougher positions made better decisions, or worse people made worse decisions. You can put your hands on that history and study it. And it's not that you're going to overlap them and say, because I read how the First World War happened, I'm going to stop
Mhm.
the Third World War from happening. You'll just be better positioned to identify those challenges as you see them. And, that includes in your daily life. There's a book by John Lewis Gaddis, a very famous Cold War historian, called On
Mhm.
Grand Strategy. And I like what he says where, grand strategy and strategy aren't just things done by states and national security establishments. They're things that people can implement in their daily lives. And so I think you learn that best by studying history and reading history. And one last thing, because I know you had mentioned too, Hannah, that you're like, oh, history and it can be intimidating. I tell people all the time, I'm like, I know there's a type of history you like. If you like
There you
sports,
go.
there's sports history. If you
Yeah.
like music, there's music history. And so, again, self-serving thing, and this is where it doesn't even have to be national security
Mhm.
history. I think everyone actually likes history. If they think about what they like in their daily lives, there's a history behind it that you can read. So, yeah, I'd say read more history or learn more history or listen to more history.
I love that. That's that's a good advice. I think all of us can implement.
Thank you.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the podcast and sharing your story and more about your book and your experiences. It's been really fun.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I've definitely enjoyed it, and I'm going to use some of what we talked about, like the complexity of the system, moving forward. So thank you again, Hannah. I appreciate it.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode of Tipping Spears. We hope this conversation challenged your perspective and sparked new curiosity about the future of intelligence. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, and we'll catch you next time with another exciting guest.